Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet, wrapped, unfortunately, in a pandemic that is a persistent challenge to everything we thought we knew and every kind of activity in life that we thought was normal. The new normal going forward will depend a lot on what happens in the United States in the next few days, November 3rd particularly. And today we're going to be exploring the intersection of climate, law, policy, and the public sphere with a great mix of practitioners and scientists. I'm Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Of course, I'm not there. I'm in the Hudson River Valley in my overloaded office, as you can see. And it's great you'll meet my guests in a minute. Lauren Kurtz from the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, Mike Mann, a climate scientist and author who's a 20-year veteran in the climate wars with a new book coming out, Adam Sobel here at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia, and who has a very provocative and important piece out in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists on not just on science in a democracy, but on how the process of science can help shape how we think about the progress in a democracy. And Romany Webb, who's at the Sabin Center for Climate and Law. But we'll hear them in a second. I wanted to start with a little bit of a snippet of what we're talking about here from the archives, sort of the Trump archives of a couple of years ago. It's quite a remarkable moment, and you'll see why it's relevant.
Eight of the Trump administration, and in plain English, the first reaction a whole lot of people had to what we're going to show you first tonight here was, do they think we're stupid? This involves the hurricane Dorian, just this minute upgraded, now a major hurricane again at Category 3, grinding up the Atlantic seaboard tonight. We'll update its course later in this hour. But the short history of our first item here is simple. Before Dorian arrived, the president said it could hit Alabama among the other projected states. He said it out loud, said it on Twitter. Problem was, it was never in the National Hurricane Center forecast. Dorian has shown us it is capable of a bunch of things, but striking Alabama on this go-round just wasn't going to happen. Indeed, it's a beautiful night in Huntsville this evening, low 80s, sun all week, first chance of rain next Tuesday. Back to our story. The president got peeved over all of this. He insisted Alabama was some of the early projections that he saw, and then we saw this. His hurricane update from the Oval Office today. The holder of the poster board is your acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Kevin McAleenan. Trump displayed the so-called cone of uncertainty forecast back from August 29th, and there, apparently drawn in Sharpie on the far left, a cone annex of sorts, a protuberance, an appendage added on to include Alabama.
You see, it was going to hit not only Florida, but Georgia. It could have was going toward the Gulf. That was what was originally projected.
This is a photo of the Oval Office briefing back on the 29th.
So,
Day 9-5.
I'm sorry. So, that felt, I think the big story that day was the laugh factor. It was kind of like, oh my God, the president is at it again. Many, many years earlier, I wrote about George W. Bush, who had an aide who came out and said to me for a story that our president he's not a pencil and eraser kind of president. He's a Sharpie president. So Sharpies and presidents tend to get chuckles. But as you can see here, NOAA chief violated ethics code in furor over Trump tweet, agency says. There's real world background here, real consequences. There were staff who were overridden, job descriptions were violated, and this is where law and climate and science and policy and messaging and presidencies really get interesting. And as you can see, of course, Michael Mann, who started out as a scientist charting past changes in climate conditions, and has ended up in court more than once, I believe. And the folks at Columbia, the Climate Law Center, and at the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund have been involved with some of that work. And just an hour ago here at Columbia, there was a webinar for journalists focusing on the case of Maria Caffrey, National Park Service, who lost her job at this intersection of climate and policy and politics. These are not just chuckles. There's real stuff going on here. So that means everyone on this call has a role, and you'll hear more about their particular roles in a second. Hold on one more second. So again, I'm going to open up to, you can see everyone's face, and we can start the conversation. As I said a minute ago, Lauren Kurtz is at Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, and Romany Webb is at the law school's Sabin Center that focuses on all aspects of climate law, has a climate deregulation tracker, and they've both been involved together in silencing science, kind of a tracker for abuse of scientists in the public sphere. And we'll get to Michael and Adam in a moment. But I was hoping that each of you, just quickly, as we just get going here, could just give a snapshot of how you became who you are, because you all didn't start out to be at this litigious, complex, fractious, noisy intersection of climate and policy, but here you are. So Lauren, could you kind of just give a thumbnail sketch, and hope you're doing well?
Yeah, doing fine under the circumstances. I mean, I actually started off life at one point, I have a degree in biology. I thought I might be a scientist, and I have so much respect for scientists, but I realized that lab work was not exactly my skill set. So I went to law school because I really wanted to be focused on solutions. I did spend some time sort of off track from that. I worked at a big firm doing financial litigation, Madoff case, for example, but really wanted to get into climate law. And in some ways, I found some of the most contentious areas in trying to get away from financial litigation. I now work on helping scientists contest anti-science actions, which I actually really enjoy. It's been a great career, even though it's also a very tough space.
And Romany, the same. Could you? And I think you're from Australia originally. Can you just give us that quick sketch of your trajectory that led you to this particular arena?
Yeah. So like Lauren, I am a lawyer, and I am from Australia, and really my Australian heritage has very much informed how I ended up doing what I'm doing. You know, I grew up, my entire childhood really spent largely in drought, and so I became very interested in water-related issues. What are we going to do when the water runs out? And that is, of course, inextricably linked up with climate change. And so that's how I kind of ended up working on climate change law. In terms of the science piece, you know, as a climate change lawyer, we stand on the shoulders of scientists. You know, you cannot design climate laws and climate policy without having a good understanding of the science of what's happening and what we need to change to prevent what's happening. It's kind of like trying to build a skyscraper without a foundation. So that's how I ended up, you know, really focused on the science and thinking about how we better integrate science into legal and policy processes.
And how's it going? How are you feeling these days?
I mean, it's been, frankly, a tough 4 years. I think there's been some high points with some of the court actions that we've seen, really pushing back against the worst of the Trump administration. But, you know, it's been a little bit patchy. So to Lauren's point, I think under the circumstances, I'm doing well. But it has been a disheartening 4 years for those of us who care about science and care about law and care about action on climate change.
I'd say that exhausting, disheartening. But again, let's get to Mike Mann, who, Mike, you're using words these days like urgency and agency. Yeah, you know, I used to say we all face this challenge of with a climate problem, particularly because of momentum and its complexity of having urgency and patience. But urgency and agency, to me, feels better. What I see here, by the way, is some of your past books and your activity on Twitter, and also you were just on 60 Minutes recently, and you're still doing science. I have a clip here of one of your recent papers, which I'd love to do a session on sometime, this question of whether there are these oscillations in the oceans or not. But so first of all, how do you be all of those Mike Manns at once?
Well, thanks, Andy, and thanks to the rest of the panel. It's great to be with you here today. Yeah, there are only 24 hours in the day, and we have to choose how we spend those hours, including hopefully getting a little bit of sleep, although these days that's hard to come by. You know, we find time for the things that matter to us, and you know, there are always sacrifices that you make when you choose to invest your time in you know, some set of activities. As you know, sort of my origin story is that I was a mild-mannered scientist nerd, published this now iconic reconstruction of temperatures back in the late 1990s, more than 2 decades ago, the hockey stick. It took on, again, iconic significance, and I found myself at the center, as you know, because you remember, I knew you during those early days. I found myself at the center of, as Andy has said, this very contentious battle over human-caused climate change. And ultimately, I came to embrace that opportunity to try to inform the larger public discourse about what is arguably the greatest challenge we face as a civilization. And so these days, I do spend a lot of my time on outreach, on communication, doing events like this. I'm trying to get the word out. And of course, it couldn't be, this particular discussion couldn't be happening at a more important time. In less than 2 weeks now, we face a monumental decision when it comes to the path forward here in the United States, but it has implications for the rest of the world when it comes to the climate crisis.
It sure does. I've never seen a juncture quite like this one, and also not to mention the pandemic. And so much of the issue around the pandemic and the issue around climate policy is synchronous. You have to have some baseline of understanding of the basic science of what epidemiology and climatology have some resonance, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? What we've witnessed play out just in a matter of months when it comes to coronavirus and the ideologically motivated attacks on the science and on the key figures in the science, like Anthony Fauci. It's sort of an accelerated example of what we have been going through now for decades in the climate space. And what we have here is the intersection of science and powerful vested interests coming into conflict. And, they're just we could spend an entire hour just talking about the parallels, the interesting parallels between coronavirus, the science, and the politics and climate change. What I would say is that we will get through this crisis, the coronavirus crisis, but looming in the background is an even greater crisis that ultimately could take an even greater toll when it comes to human lives. And so maybe, if you're an optimist like I am, we can see this as an opportunity, maybe to open up a larger conversation about, basic questions regarding sustainability, living sustainably on this planet, and confronting the challenges and embracing what science has to teach us when it comes to the crises that we face.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to Adam, who's, again, I assume, Adam, you came into this through, well, for you, I think it was physics and math, and then into climate science. And I imagine there must have been a fork in the road that led you into the public sphere. I want to show the piece you just did for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And here's a sort of a broader landscape of your increasingly public presence. You actually did some pieces for the New York Times recently, live kind of assessments of hurricanes going forward. So for you, what was that transition point? And how are you doing these days?
Right. Thanks, Andy. I was trying to remember how you phrased it initially before you turned it over to the four of us, what you said, how we came to be at the interface of climate and politics and law or something like that. You had some way, and I felt kind of honored that your assessment of me is that I am at that interface. I've been struggling with how much to be there and how to be there. So there wasn't one transition point. I trained in physics as an undergrad. I studied meteorology, it was called then, graduate school in the mid-90s. Mike and I are about the same generation. And I'm an introvert. I have always had political views for sure, but politics and activism have never come easily to me. And indeed, in the first, 6, 8, 10 years of my career, I actually worked as an atmospheric scientist. I didn't work on global warming because the politics of it just made, kind of gave me the heebie-jeebies. I mean, I believed in the mainstream science, but I just kind of stayed away from it but that changed over time. It just became too big such the elephant in the room that, you couldn't not work on it. It was like being, if you're a doctor, the analogy I give to people is if you're a doctor or a medical researcher and everybody in your community has AIDS and you don't study AIDS, at some point you're missing the boat, right? So that was kind of how I felt about that. But then I stayed pretty much an academic scientist for a long time. But what started getting me engaged was hurricanes. I mean, I was working on hurricanes And then when Sandy happened, I became a minor public figure, overnight, because I just started getting a lot of media calls and responding to them. And I found that I kind of could do that and liked it. I wrote a book, and then that led to a transition in my research to a bit more applied work on hurricane risk. Mike is involved in some similar stuff. And that is related to disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation, and just the whole process of engaging with a more broader, with the public through public communication and outreach and media and writing and all that, as well as doing that applied work, which had me interacting with more people outside of our field, including in the insurance industry, which is a user of our science, but also, public audiences and stuff. That just got me thinking more about what it is we do and why we do it, and what value it is besides the pure intellectual value that at least drew me to it. I mean, I didn't come into science really out of a feeling that I was going to, do anything but have an interesting work, but it became about more than that over time. And then I think, but watching the direction our politics has gone over the years, and with Trump, being this very severe sort of, culmination of where the Republican Party's been going for some time.
An extreme event.
It's like, I think it forced a lot of us, definitely me, to think like, what are we doing here? What is the value of what we're doing, and why are we doing it? Especially in an environment where I think those of us of my generation, at least those who grew up with some reasonable amount of privilege, which is what it normally takes to get to a graduate, get through a graduate degree. We took for granted some amount of functionality in our democratic process and its overall, and its use of expertise and science and fact-based, information. And just to see that not just sort of crumble, but be just flagrantly rejected at the very top level of our government was just, forced a reckoning for me. And it's been a struggle to figure out what to do about it, frankly. I don't feel that I've arrived at any great answer to that. I'm not as much of a public figure as some are, certainly as Mike is. But, it's led me to think about doing what I can. And, so I write stuff here and there, and there's a few trying to find other ways to be engaged. But I think it is a struggle because a lot of us who came up through as scientists almost define our jobs as being sort of outside of that public sphere. If you think of what the meaning of the word academic is, right, it sort of means outside of everything else. So It's been a struggle to think of how to sort of retain that element of our job, and at the same time to recognize that we have some responsibility as citizens, and not only as citizens, but citizens in a position of sort of privilege and authority, to think about how to best use that.
Right, and that alone is an interesting arena where, like Ken Caldera, a climate scientist I've known for a long time, used to talk. I guess he got an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and he's the one who led me to David Hume back a couple hundred years ago, who said, you can't get an ought from an is. An is basically science, including what we don't know. And an ought is like policy. What do we do? And that dynamic is there in spades. And also for journalists. Remember, journalists, at least those who are not opinion writers, have a responsibility to convey what we know and don't know. It has that same feel. And Mike, you've been deep in that question of how to comport, how to frame. I want to go back to the law and then come back to this question, because it's really important before we end, especially for young or emerging scholars and scientists who might learn some lessons from what we're saying here about how to protect yourself and how to be effective. That'll be the last part. So we'll circle back to like, what do you do? But let's get back into that question of the legal elements here. Hold on, I'm just going to go back to that imagery so we can have something to orient toward right here. So climate, there are these two portals right now, which I can show. There's the climate, whoops, wrong way. Oh no, sorry. We'll stay here. There's the climate deregulation tracker that evolved at the law school, and the silencing science tracker. Lauren, maybe because the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund is partners on the silencing science part. Let's talk about that first. And maybe Lauren, can you dive in a little bit, and then Romini?
Yeah. So my organization, the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, we partner with the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at the Columbia Law School to create this silencing science tracker. We built on some trackers that the law school had already been working on, such as the climate deregulation tracker. But the silencing science tracker catalogs public media events and that are government incidents of the government attempting or successfully affecting a silencing of science. And Romany can talk more about the categories that we use for that tracker and how that compares and contrasts to the other trackers they use. The interesting thing about the tracker from the perspective of my organization is, I think it's really important for people to see what's happening and to understand the extent and the breadth of which the ways in which the federal and state and local governments have tried to silence science. But I think it's also important to note that many of the examples in the tracker are unfortunately unresolved. My organization is focused on helping scientists fight these actions, and it's been tough because even though there are ways in which the legal system should be able to contest these actions and tries to contest these actions, when the policies and laws were written, I think there was a real failure of imagination as to how they might play out in the current scenario. So you have things like scientific integrity policies, which are, many of them go back to the 70s, but they were really beefed up in the Obama era. But they still fall short in many ways. Some of them, like the CDCs, for example, don't consider political interference a violation of scientific integrity.
Wow.
You have issues like you previously had up an image of Mia Caffrey. She's an entry in the tracker because she was a scientist who tried to publish a report about how human-caused climate change was affecting sea level rise in national parks, coastal national parks, and her supervisors of the National Park Service tried to remove all references to human-caused climate change in the report, which was an important predicate for her research about how we can actually affect the level of sea level rise in the national parks. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful. She fought tooth and nail, and it was determined that that was not a violation of scientific integrity because the attempts to remove the references to human-caused climate change were unsuccessful. I think that's very similar to saying that attempted murder is not a crime because no one was actually killed.
Right.
Which is really terrible. And the Sharpiegate incident that you referenced earlier, they did actually find that was a violation, which is great. But I think it's still an example where they fell short because the people who were responsible for what happened were not punished. The determination there was a violation listed some suggestions, more trainings, more policy guidelines, great stuff. But I think it just didn't go far enough. So there's more to be done.
That reminds me, unfortunately, of something. There was a quote from, I think it was Cheney or someone in the Bush administration, in a big front page cover story in the magazine, the Times magazine, years ago, where they basically said they're just plowing forward and doing stuff, and everyone can catch up.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what we've seen with the Trump administration has that same quality.
Yes.
The White House ceremony that clearly violates the Hatch Act. They said, well, screw that, let's get the photo op and litigate that some year from now and this is what can get discouraging, getting back to the urgency and agency or the patience or the fortitude part. It feels like this is always a work in progress. Romany, how does that feel sometimes? What does that lead to? I do think Sabin has been incredibly adaptive and agile in the way the Sabin Climate Law Center comes up with new ways to get at this.
Yeah, I think to your point, Andy, we've seen a similar thing in the regulatory space where the Trump administration is just kind of plowing ahead with its efforts to dismantle climate regulations, really with no regard for the consequences or frankly, even the process that they're meant to follow. And so that is one place where we've had a few successes where these regulatory actions taken by the Trump administration have been blocked by the courts on those sort of procedural grounds. Basically, they just did a shoddy job and weren't up to scratch. But, it does, I think, highlight the need for public engagement on these topics. Like, it just cannot be overstated. And so that is, to some degree, some of the rationale behind why we have developed things like the Silencing Science Tracker and the Climate Deregulation Tracker. The media has done a good job, I think, of publicizing the bigger ticket items like the repeal of the Clean Power Plan and the changes to vehicle emission standards. But there's a raft of other regulations that maybe are a little smaller. But, when we're thinking about climate change, where there's so many sources of greenhouse gas emissions, all of those regulations matter. And having people understand that each of those things is happening, and even more important, perhaps, having people get involved in processes around the changing of those regulations is hugely important. So the trackers, I think, make it easy for people to see what's going on, also make it easy for people to engage in the various processes in a way that they probably wouldn't be able to if we were just reliant on the government publications, like in the Federal Register or hidden on a government website.
And I know that the tracker essentially relies also on an ecosystem of communication. In other words, both trackers really, you need to have active understanding that there's a place to document the abuse of scientists in the public realm, or especially in the bureaucracy. And journalists often are the folks poking at that through their skill sets, and journalists are more protected and can protect those voices more than a non-journalistic outfit. So how important is building that ecosystem? I know we had a session this morning separate from this call with journalists, and is it well understood that this takes a village essentially?
Yeah, I think that's really incredibly true for the Silencing Science Tracker. I think it is less true for the Climate Deregulation Tracker because the government is sort of legally required to publish a lot of things, and then we can kind of scoop that up and aggregate it. But with the Silencing Science Tracker, we are reliant on whistleblowers who talk to the press and media who are willing to report on those issues. We are academics, we're not journalists, we can't offer people the same protections that a journalist can offer them. So it's hugely important to have, as you said, this kind of whole village of people working on these issues, raising awareness of these issues, and hugely important to have the individual scientists being willing to speak up.
I just was distracted by a comment coming in. We'll get to viewer questions in a couple minutes. Hold on, let me just widen the view again. Oops, come on. Stuck, there we go. So Mike, from the science end, you probably have the most experience at that interface. And I'd like to start to get to some lessons learned in terms of coaching or advice for so many in our fields who are, I did a survey at Columbia right after I started the initiative here on communication and sustainability, reaching out to hundreds of faculty, staff, and students. And for example, I said, who is enthusiastic about communicating with the public? Who likes to give public talks? And who's enthusiastic about social media? And there's a pretty good chunk of people, about 30% or so for each. And I said, who is hesitant but hopeful? And there's like a big chunk, but they're not engaged, right? There's a fear factor, as we've heard before. If you're getting tenure, you don't want to get, especially for young scholars and doers. So thinking back on your track, could you spend a few minutes talking about what practices or relationships with law firms might be helpful?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. My circumstances are a little unusual. I didn't really choose to be a science communicator. I was sort of forced out into the public sphere, in essence, by the attacks on my science and the attacks on me. And ultimately, as I said earlier, I recognized that as an opportunity to do something that I hadn't signed up for. I would have been perfectly happy if they had left me alone in the laboratory, crunching numbers, writing code, solving problems, figuring out how things work. That's what led me to science. That's why I double majored in applied math and physics at UC Berkeley. It wasn't to put myself on a path into the center of again, the most fractious societal debate we've ever had. I didn't think that training was setting me up for that. But when I found myself under those circumstances and in the fray, like I said, I chose to use that as an opportunity. And so it was sort of sink or swim. I wasn't formally trained in communication. I had to sort of watch what others do, what others did, and try to learn from, those scientists who came before me and who did choose to engage. Steve Schneider, of course, was a good friend of both of ours, Andy, and he was really the first scientist in our field to forge that path, to be a public scientist and to engage the public and to speak to issues outside the direct realm of science, the societal implications, the political implications, policy. So he and others created a space for people like me to move into. Today, I like to think that Adam and I and others of our generation are doing the same for the next generation of scientists. And as you allude to, the good news is that there are so many scientists now who want to play a role, who want to engage with the public. They've been brought up in the age of social media. It's a natural extension of their being to communicate. And we don't have the obstacles that we used to have to participating in the public dialogue. You can do it directly through social media. And so we have the luxury of having a very large population of scientists who have been trained in how to engage and are passionate about engaging. And the societies and the science organizations, the National Academy, AAAS, AGU, have all taken a very active role in providing opportunities, providing training. I know Lauren has done multiple sessions at these conferences, informing scientists about sort of the legal realm and its intersection with science and science policy. But the scientific community has sort of risen to the challenge. There is sort of the cautionary tale of Carl Sagan. He was the great, communicator of our era, scientist, but an amazing communicator. And he paid a price. He was blackballed from the National Academy of Sciences by scientists who felt it was beneath a scientist to want to engage with the public and to be, on the Johnny Carson show. But I think that we've learned our lesson. The scientific community has learned its lesson because of the success of anti-science campaigns that have been orchestrated by fossil fuel interests and other special interests. And scientists have found themselves sort of powerless on the sidelines. That has created this groundswell of support now within the infrastructure of science for training scientists to engage. And again, the others here are all involved in that in one way or another. And to me, it's very gratifying. It's very gratifying that today the National Academy actually awards that. I was inducted into the Academy earlier this year, and not in spite of my efforts to communicate the science, but I think in large part because of those efforts. And to me, it speaks volumes. And so that's the good news. The bad news is we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, actually, that I hadn't thought about that. It's congratulations on that, and I hadn't thought about it in that context because that does reflect a big shift. I do remember in 2010, I had a conversation with Ralph Cicerone, an atmospheric scientist, chemist who was the president of the academies, and at that time he was bemoaning the Academy's own
reticence,
slowness at engaging in public questions, and what do we do? And here we are at a very different point. And he's sorely missed too, another figure. And Adam, I want to get into, there's another angle here that's kind of cool that came up in your piece for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And it's kind of flipping this around. It's not what we can do to protect the role of science in the public sphere, but it's what are the lessons from how science works in how to think better about engaging, having the public discourse on policy go forward. You said in science, our job is actually, if you can all mute, that'd be great. There's a bit of a feedback. In science, our job is not to prove our opponent wrong at all costs, but to work together to search for truth. When we abandon that principle, science doesn't work. In a healthy scientific community, one can't win by grandstanding, threatening, or bullying. And everything you described there resonates with me as being the great challenge in the public sphere right now too, whether it's on fracking or COVID-19, or it'll be CRISPR next, as this technology that's going to change everything. There used to be an Office of Technology Assessment that the Congress relied on, and then they X'd that out, and that was an underpinning. I wonder if I could ask each of you to reflect on, and Adam first, on what elements could we bring to the public sphere, to policy generation, that can maybe create that kind of landscape you just described that comes out of good science? What
Well, I
would
mean,
that look like? Like if you could, well, of course, there is an Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. The current one has been completely invisible. That's one thing. On COVID-19, the Surgeon General has been largely invisible. There was we did some conversations recently on that role can be elevated. But I don't know if you have thought, what would this look like thinking about a better picture for going forward.
yeah, I mean, I was trying to do a few different things in that article. I mean, partly it was just a cry of pain. That's taken a few years for me to find a way to start to let it out. But I'm obviously not alone in the basic feeling, so I don't need to say anything more about that. I mean, in talking about the science as a social process, I was trying to articulate something that I think, is what makes engaging in public discourse difficult for a lot of scientists, and especially on contentious issues like climate, and now apparently COVID as well, is that the nature of the political argument, or the nature, and also the nature of legal arguments, since we're talking about law, is very different from the nature of scientific argument. Because in scientific argument, we're really trained to be self-critical. We're supposed to recognize the flaws in our argument and state them before anybody else does. And that's what peer review beats into us. And that is not how the legal system works. It's not how the political system works, right? In those cases, you're trying to win. And you're not really supposed to lie, but anything short of outright, I mean, you don't have to present the other side's argument for them, and so, whereas in science you do. And so I think we get caught up in that, for a lot of us, it just makes us feel very uncomfortable to communicate in a way that, and it makes it hard sometimes people to listen to us talk, because we want to say all the caveats and the complications, and that's too complicated. People just want a short answer, and that's what sort of the political process calls for. So that's what I was sort of going for there. And I don't know how to make the policy process better than what it's been in the past. I'm not an expert in policy. Now it's failing totally, right? Because as Romany was articulating, we've gone past a case where you have people in power distorting the science or misrepresenting it or picking one side and it's just saying F you, we're not listening at all, we're going to do whatever we want, we don't care what you say. I mean, that's basically the Trump administration's approach to science, right? They're not, I mean, in past, the climate denial movement that Mike's the expert on, would try to sort of distort the science and confuse it, but this is just saying we don't care. You guys are out of power and we don't want to listen to you anymore, and that's it. And so, it's easy to see how to improve on that, right? But the other thing I was trying to do in this article was that maybe is relevant here is, I think, and this was a little bit hard to, articulate at this moment when I feel like it's maybe not the problem, but I think we scientists are often very naive about how this works. We say, we have people who don't listen to the science, and that implies that if you listen to the science, you would know what to do. I mean, you talked about the is and the ought, but the historians and philosophers of science have told us how science is not a pure process of generating truth. It's influenced by human realities too. And I think, and especially in areas where science is about, where the science exists because of contentious social or political, economic problems, the science is always charged, and that influences how we do our work. And so I think understanding how science really is, which is really not the textbook model of how it is. I mean, the scientific method is not a simple thing where you have a hypothesis and you test it. It's much more subtle and complicated than that. Right. And it's not democracy. I mean, we scientists don't vote on what's right, but there's a little bit of that element in there, right? Because when we know we're right is when we can convince all our colleagues. And so there is something a little bit like democracy there. And I was trying to get that across, that I think we as scientists could get maybe a little more sophisticated in how we think about how our work is done and what it is and how it enters the public sphere. And I think, just to address one other thing that you were asking Mike about, is, I think the younger generation is very idealistic, I think more than ours was. And so they may have stuff to learn from us, but we have stuff to learn from them too. I'm involved now in a course that we're doing here, a graduate level course on environmental racism and climate justice. And that was created by PhD students. The faculty who are involved are just going along for the ride. And, you know, so that's a case where the needle is being moved by the younger generation, not by us. And the other thing that's related to that is I think one thing we could all learn who are engaged in the public sphere, or that, you know, scientists who want to get engaged in it could keep in mind now, at least on the climate problem, is some humility. Because the climate problem is at a point now where I think it's really not a science problem, fundamentally. I mean, we know what the science is, right? The science kind of is settled enough for the political for where the political process is. And so that means that it's not just our story anymore. And so I think it's important for scientists to be in the public sphere, but we shouldn't be dominating it, because if we do that, that sort of implies that it belongs in the science page of the newspaper. Right. You know, to the you know, if that's an anachronism by this point, but you know, you get the meaning. and it isn't, right? It should be in all the pages of the newspaper, and that means it shouldn't just be us talking about it. So I think we could stand, you know, just be humble and recognize there's a lot we don't know and a lot that's not for us to say.
I'd love to circle back to those points in a minute through Michael's lens too, but I want to get back to the law. Lauren and Romany, you know the legal landscape. You know, it's like when you think about the laws that were passed under bipartisan times, with Nixon signing them, you know, creating the EPA, that era, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, NEPA, which a lot of folks are fighting now. There's a robust history there that creates a landscape that allows the climate deregulation tracker to be showing success stories too, right? Where things are not moving forward, even though Trump wields his Sharpie. Are there other laws that can come into play here? I know, obviously, as you both have said, there's failure so far, right? You know, there was this sort of high-speed demolition crew that's been at work for 4 years. But when you think forward, are there tools or legislation that can be brought to bear here to help build that landscape of efficacy? And maybe Romany first.
That's it. Maybe I'll start off on the regulation, and Lauren can talk more about the science issues. But you know, it's certainly true that some Trump administration actions have been blocked using those statutes that you talked about, Andy. NEPA in particular has been a really powerful tool. But as I said before, they are decisions that block regulations or dismiss regulations primarily on procedural grounds. So if Trump wins another term, you know, they have an opportunity to go back to the drawing board, follow the correct procedure, and really adopt basically what was just thrown out. So it's almost a stopgap measure, to be honest. You know, I think that dynamic, and also the dynamic we saw when Trump came in and just sort of immediately started reversing those Obama era regulations, shows the real limits of a sort of approach that's housed within the executive branch of the government, that is necessarily subject to political whims with who goes in and out of the White House. So a legislative solution to climate change would be, you know, much more durable and effective. The challenge, as you said, is that all of the, you know, most of the major environmental statutes were passed with bipartisan support, and it's hard to see that happening in the climate space. Just to go back very quickly to your previous question and to Adam's points, you know, I think part of the problem here is education. Education around the value of science, around what science shows and what it doesn't, is hugely important, both for, you know, members of Congress, for judges who are increasingly being asked to decide climate-related issues, and for the general public. You know, we see one of the things that I think is most disturbing about what we record in the Silencing Science Tracker are attacks on science education, attempts at the state level to prevent the teaching of climate change in schools, to change the way it's taught, to present it as a controversial or unresolved issue. You know, that really could have long-lasting consequences for the next generation. But I know Lauren has some things to add on the science side.
And could you just, I think you guys do some seminars for judges, is that correct?
Yeah, we've in the past, we've done a series of judicial trainings in collaboration with the Environmental Law Institute. Our executive director, Michael Berger, and our faculty director, Michael Gerard, do a lot of work on the judicial front, which I think is hugely important.
That's great. Yeah, that gets to this importance also of intersectional work at Columbia. We're building a climate school, And it's not just a climate science school, as Adam knows. It's about the question of climate change and the question of all these dimensions, which means a lot more social science, a lot more crosstalk, including professionalization. What do we need to do to create a landscape of informed professionals in all these fields, not just law and you name it. So that seems to be a huge pathway forward as well. I'm sure at Penn State, and I know Stanford and other, we're all talking about convergence and some version of what Columbia's President Bollinger calls the fourth purpose, meaning the intersection between what we do and study with these outcomes in society. So Lauren, if you could, fill in a couple blanks there about what could happen differently going forward.
Yeah. I mean, we could use improvements in a number of areas, but one that I think I would very much like to see is more protections for federal scientists to speak out and to do their research without censorship. I mentioned earlier these federal scientific integrity policies, which were written with very noble goals, but it's been frustrating to see them either subverted or loopholes used to avoid tackling the issues that we've seen the last few years. So I would love to see more rigorous scientific integrity policies implemented, whether that be through an executive action or as Romany noted, legislative action would in some ways be even better. And there is a pending House Scientific Integrity Act, so it would be nice to see that move to an actually implemented law. I think it's also important that the employee regulations as a general matter in the federal government are uneven, and the whistleblower protections for scientists, especially given the ways in which scientists can have different arrangements. They can split their federal role with the university role, and there are a lot of ways in which scientists can fall in the cracks, and I think it's a really frustrating situation. So I definitely hear Adam's earlier point that we don't want to over-focus on the science because it gives the false impression that there's controversy to be had there. But I also think that it's really important that we allow scientists to have a voice and to continue to educate the public and to weigh in on these really important matters. And right now, we've done a very terrible job of
Mike, I want to get to you now, but there was a comment that came in that I think is worth surfacing because it gets at one of these sad realities. Scott Murto from YouTube says, sadly relevant, there are presently 4,444 peeps watching the SpaceX Boca Chica space shipyard live feed compared to 15 here. Now, thousands will be here ultimately. So this is not a hopeless case. But maybe one of the lessons I draw from looking at that is SpaceX wouldn't exist if it weren't for a shitload of science, for one thing. So if you care about that, finding that bigger way of conveying science matters seems important. But Mike, this issue does often still, even now, even with California's fires and even with this hurricane season that you both have been tracking so closely, it's still not a front page story, or especially on TV. So getting people to understand the value of protecting scientists, of the value of building a science-based landscape of decision-making around big risks. There is that, this just came up in the sense of education. There's still a grand challenge here, right? So what does that feel like?
Yeah, I'd like to answer your question, but I've got to go check out this SpaceX Boca Chica.
Yeah, we can call
I
this.
didn't realize that was going. No, I'm just kidding. So, this has been a great discussion, and there are lots of competing and potentially conflicting impulses and factors when it comes to sort of the role of the scientist in the public space. And some years ago, I guess it's now more than 5 years ago, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, if you see something, say something. And in some sense, it was sort of an expression of sort of, it was, an effort to sort of, in some ways, draw upon sort of the legacy of Carl Sagan and Steve Schneider and Rachel Carson and other scientists who have stepped up and decided to participate in our public discourse. My argument in the piece is that, if we choose not to engage, you're good. There it is. Then we leave behind a vacuum that will be filled by those who are not informed about the underlying science, or not as well informed about the underlying science, and have an agenda which isn't just the sort of objective assessment and explanation of the scientific evidence, but a policy agenda, an industry agenda. And so, as Adam said, there should be humility on the part of those of us who can, choose to participate in the public sphere. And Steve Schneider would often, make this point that we should be as clear as possible about what hat we're wearing. Are we speaking as, Mike Mann, the scientist, or am I speaking as Mike Mann, the citizen, who, like any citizen, has a right, has a privilege and a responsibility, arguably, to speak out about, the challenges that we face and the threats that we face and the societal implications of the science. And so as long as we attempt to sort of navigate that space with some humility and to be clear about, what we're trying to accomplish and what role we're playing. Steve Schneider had another great quote, it's advice for the would-be science communicator. And I think this quote, Andy. Know thy audience, know thyself, know thy stuff.
Yeah.
And to me, it's the ultimate sort of condensation of what we need to think about when we do communicate. Know the audience. Who are you speaking to? What are you trying to communicate to them? Use the language, language and framing that is appropriate to that audience. That's know thy audience, but know thyself. Be comfortable in your own skin. Be yourself. Don't try to be someone you're not, because an audience will see right through that. Authenticity is critical to gain the trust of your audience. And know thy stuff. Try to be as informed, not just about the science, but about the larger dimensions that the science speaks to. Because I know, for one thing, when I first started speaking, giving lectures about climate change, I would leave my audiences wanting, because I would lecture about the science and the impacts, and I'd just leave it there. Well, you figure it out. You figure out what to do. No, our people want to see some leadership from scientists, because our views about policy, about the policy options, about the risks, are informed by the fact that we study the science. That's why Carl Sagan had the voice that he had. He spoke with authority. He was a scientist. He was a leading scientist, and that brought an imprimatur to what he had to say. Finally, I would just take ever so gentle. I would ever so gently disagree a little bit with something that Adam said about the state of the science and our sort of, in our role in communicating the science. Yeah, the basics are well understood, right? We're not debating whether the planet is warming up, whether we're responsible for it, or whether we're seeing, some pretty damaging and dangerous impacts already. But as we know from just watching this campaign, watching previous debates, and following the public discourse over the hurricane season that we're going through, an unprecedented hurricane season, the fact that the Western U.S. has been ablaze, unlike anything we've seen before. Our president and vice president have in debates, in the presidential and vice presidential debates, challenged the notion that there is a connection between climate change and these extreme weather events that are playing out. And so scientists play a role in that conversation, because we actually can speak to that. And hopefully we can do that with, appropriate caveats and appropriate, with nuance. But, and Adam spoke to this as well earlier, and Susan Joy Hassel, who's, sort of a mentor to many of us, a climate communication expert, has talked a lot about how, because we scientists work at sort of the forefront of the science, we spend our time right at the limits of uncertainty, because that's what we're working on. We can lose track. We can lose perspective about the accepted stuff, the stuff that we're not debating anymore. And when we speak to public audiences, we have to speak almost in the opposite direction from how we would speak to fellow scientists. In a
Right.
scientific talk, you spend most of your time talking about the forefront of the science, where you're doing your research. And, the context is assumed to be relatively well understood. We lead with our uncertainty. We lead with the caveats because that's where we're working. That's the edge of our scientific understanding, where scientists spend their time. But when you speak to the public, lead with what we do know, right? If nothing else, yes, humans are responsible for the warming of the planet. We're seeing the impacts play out in real time. There's still time to do something about it. There is urgency. We have to act now. There's agency. We can do something to make it, to prevent it from getting worse. And given time, if you have the opportunity, you can say, now there are things we're still trying to understand, the precise relationship between tropical storms and hurricanes and climate change and how they're being impacted, and the roles of various factors in these wildfires that are playing out. But let's lead with what we know. And that's a lesson that we've learned from other, great science communicators. And it's something that, again, my good friend Susan Joy Hassel has tried to instill among would-be science communicators. Lead with what we know. That's the most important thing for your audience to hear. And then you can layer it in caveat, uncertainty, context.
And I'm showing her website just to make the point that there are resources here. It's not like everyone has to start from scratch. And here at Columbia, again, one of my big focuses of my program is a resilience media project, which is bringing in all these journalists who are not at the New York Times, not at the Washington Post, Pulitzer-winning places, who are struggling just to get through the day and having shrinking budgets. What can we do to foster a better interface between science and the data and the expertise and that landscape? And here you have climatecommunication.org. Susan is involved with other work for Climate Central. So we're not starting from scratch. And I'm hoping that when people review this webcast, they'll come to us and find more ways to connect. And obviously, for those of you in the legal arena, it's the same. At CSLDF.org, climatesciencelegalDefense.org, and at Sabin, people can search for Sabin Climate Law. And, it's a good way to start if you're a scientist at any level who's struggling with a question, right? So do you have other simple ways for them to reach out to you? And then, Adam, I'm going to get back to you one more time before we close things out. So Lauren and Romany, what's the best path for that interface? Like, who are you going to call?
Sure. I mean, any scientist with a legal question is encouraged to reach out to us. We are free and confidential. Our website is csldf.org. And there's contact info on the page, or you can send a web form. Both are just fine, and will get to us, and we will set up a call with you as soon as possible to talk through whatever's bothering you.
That's good. And do you have a way to reach someone if someone calls who's a COVID-19 scientist? In other words, is there a network of groups
Yes.
like yours?
Yes. I mean, we largely work with climate scientists, but there have been times in which scientists from other disciplines have come to us and they're experiencing the exact same problems. And on a case-by-case basis, we have been able to help them, or at the very least connect them with a group that's better situated to deal with their particular issue. So that's a great question, because I think we've all seen that, a lot of the science denial and anti-science issues and attacks around the pandemic are very evocative of what has been happening to climate scientists for decades.
Sure. And Romany, the same thing. Your Twitter tag is at Columbia Climate, I believe. Is that correct? I'm showing it here. Actually, maybe she's frozen. At any rate, so now, Adam, I want to kind of circle back to you for one last time, because that piece again that you wrote was really powerful. I'm hoping people will read it. And you make these points about democracy and science that are really important to sink in. So Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, you can just Google for Adam, Sobel, and Bulletin and find this great story. Adam, a last takeaway, maybe if you want to respond a little bit to that idea that Michael had floated as well.
Which idea? The idea about whether it's a science issue or not,
how you shape that output and
yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't have any disagreement with what Mike said. That's all. We could talk about that for a long time, but we're in agreement about it. Obviously, there are contentious science issues still, and scientists are voices are critical on those. there's a lot of issues about climate that are now out of the realm of scientific debate, and so we should recognize that. But I just think the right thing to end on is this election. I mean, it's I think a lot of us are really acutely aware that the basic democracy that we thought we could take for granted in this country is threatened. And the attacks on science from this administration are part and parcel of that. The authoritarian viewpoint opposes any challenges to power of the authoritarian, right? And that power extends to wanting to control reality completely. So science is a challenge to authority in that science tries to determine what reality is as in as unbiased a way as possible. And to the extent that it can do that, it means that nobody can control what the answer is, and that makes it a challenge to somebody who wants to control everything. And whether the U.S. is not an authoritarian state yet, but that's clearly the impulse that of Trump and those who are following him is an authoritarian impulse, whether or not they've been able to completely, materialize as possible. So, for those of us who, I think the desire to have a reality-based society is somewhat the same as wanting to have a democracy. I mean, it's a system where people work together to understand the world and to make the world as good a place as we can make it, and to give everybody a voice. And that's what's at stake here. And so I think nothing I said is particularly original or critical there, but that's what we're looking at in these 2 weeks. So please vote. That was the last 2 words I wrote. I think there's no those are the 2 most important words we can say
Amen.
at this moment in time. Andy, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I muted myself to avoid the feedback. Yeah, Mike, I think you were tweeting about having voted. Our advanced voting starts Saturday. So my son and I are driving over to Carmel, across the county here in Putnam County, New York, to deposit our votes.
It's such a good
in
feeling.
person.
Yeah.
It's such a good feeling. It's a good feeling having you all here today. Lauren Kurtz from the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, Michael Mann, great author. I can't wait to read your book and your next book, The New Climate War, from Penn State. Adam Sobel from the Earth Institute's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. We just finished our big open house, which was virtual this year, a lot of work. And Romany Webb from the Climate Science Law Group at the Sabin Center at the Columbia Law School. Thank you so much. I want to just show you where we're going next on this journey I'm on with this. So every Sunday is music. And Emma's Revolution, the duo named themselves for Emma Goldman, the anarchist. But they have a song out that's unbelievable called Vote Their Asses Out, which is going to be featured. And Monday, we get to that skill building stuff we were talking about. How do scientists or anyone else who wants to communicate effectively online? Having Sri Srinivasan from Stony Brook, who's a chief digital officer formerly for New York City, Columbia University, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is going to be on to demonstrate you really can thrive online. It doesn't feel that way quite often. And then next Wednesday, speaking of race, gender, equity, and the like, we're going to have a discussion about a recent film called Picture a Scientist, which is a very powerful documentary on the challenges that have faced women in all the fields we focus on. And Marcia McNutt, among others, the president of the National Academies, will be on with us. So that's going to be awesome. And thank you all again for being part of what I call Sustain What. It's a question mark because we're headed into uncharted territory here. We have a lot of work to do. Sustainability is an idea. It's a vision. Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the One Earth system changing faster than the actual environment, how we share and shape ideas. It's a very hacked system right now. It's polarizing us. It's designed to polarize us. It's designed to distract us. So getting work done takes skill. It takes time and training, as Mike Mann said. The webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. My vision is we can make information matter more than it does right now. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends and circles far and wide, and get in touch with ideas. See that little distracting scrolling bar at the bottom for ways to do that. Thanks again to my guests for being here today. And I hope you'll all think about coming back sometime. Michael, especially when your book is coming out.
Thanks. It was a pleasure,
all.
everyone.
So stay
Thank
safe, stay resilient, reach out, connect safely from a distance. Physical distancing, not social distancing. Words matter. Thanks again.
Thank you.